Okie dokie.
All right. Hi, everybody. So my name is Grace Guilliams.
My name is Alyssa Skikus.
And today we're going to be doing the first part of assignment 2, which is our video book review. So today we're going to be talking about Broke, the Racial Consequences of Underfunding Public Universities. This is by Hamilton and Nielsen. It's a fairly new book, came out last year. And just kind of a overarching summary is that the authors performed an ethnography on two different schools, UCR and UCM, which is University of California, Riverside and Merced. And these are two institutions that within the UC system primarily serve the largest population of low-income Black and Latinx students. So really what the authors were trying to do was answer questions about how defunding public education shapes institutions that serve underrepresented students, what strategies new universities use to survive and then even to thrive in this kind of new landscape of racial neoliberalism in higher ed, and then how does the defunding impact the low-income families and their access to research universities. So with answering those questions, they first defined broke, and I just kind of want to touch on that very briefly because there's three different definitions that are simultaneously used for broke. So the first is that it refers to the broken post-secondary system that segregates students by race and class. And they argue that, segregation is still alive in the post-secondary system, and that's an issue we tend to see when we're talking about K through 12, but they argue that it exists in higher ed as well. The other way that it's used is it's talking about the fiscally broken universities and the withdrawal of public support in higher ed. That's an issue that we've talked about a lot in this class, but also in the whole cohort. And then they also use it to describe the promise of new universities to break the mold for any research university to kind of challenge the status of hierarchies based on student background. And that's really what a new university is trying to do. So you'll see that throughout our conversation, but I just wanted to set this up and I'll just kind of state the thesis and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of our conversation. So Hamilton and Nielsen argue that new university administrators, motivated by the idea that public disinvestment is inevitable, engage in austerity practices. They aim to grow big, cut costs, be market smart, and think internationally. These practices, however, are counterproductive, entrenching austerity and generating racial inequalities. End quote.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, Grace, I remember getting to the part of the book where I saw this chart and I was like, holy guacamole. It's very overwhelming. And I remember looking at it and being like, what is going on? But it's super in depth. Is there something that struck you right away?
So whenever I look at a cycle like this, and this is pretty early on, so this is the racial neoliberalism cycle, I think to myself, where do I even start? But you can't even ask yourself that question because it's a circle. So the thing that stands out to me is the social construction of merit, first and foremost, because I have a background in tutoring students who were getting ready for the SAT and ACT, which is something that Hamilton and Nielsen talk a lot about. And I had ethical issues working at a tutoring club because I didn't even believe in these kinds of tests being used to determine who should get into college and whether they're actually ready for school. And fortunately, the authors agreed with me because they said that merit has no, at least our construction of merit doesn't really have a strong relationship with college performance. It just redraws racial boundaries. They said that merit is anything but race neutral. And that hit home for me because I worked at Columbus State as an advisor a lot with low-income students, students of color who didn't have strong academic backgrounds based on traditional definitions of merit that we've been, I don't know, programmed. I'm not sure the right word to believe that, oh, that's what being meritorious is. You get what you deserve. You work hard, things will come, but those things ignore structural racism. So that's kind of the first thing that stands out to me, but I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I just remember having a moment of, oh my gosh, I didn't realize how privileged I was in my experience in my high school and middle school and elementary experience, K through 12, but also in college itself, especially when looking at the distribution of organizational resources. And it does go into the conversation we had a little bit ago, but just about K through 12 resources, but really it's a cycle that starts from the beginning. It starts from the first school that a student attends and the education that they're receiving from the beginning and the way that they learn everything and collect that information and then take it with them, especially when it comes to institutions that do require testing, because institutions that require testing not only are giving out merit based on unequal distributions of organizational resources, those scholarships are going to students that are going to test higher, but that is also a way of segregating the educational systems, because they're then taking the top of the top, which are always going to be the students that are wealthier and the more elite students that have the access to those resources to have tutoring. They may need that tutoring and be able to have that resource, but that doesn't mean that students from lower income institutions or lower income households are going to have that access. And so it really comes down to this combination for me of looking at how all of these exist in a bigger systemic issue of racism. And honestly, just kind of experiencing how that feels for someone as myself, who I have not experienced that. I did not experience that personally, but now when I work in admissions, I see what that looks like, at least a
All the
little bit.
time.
Yeah, I know, and it's painful. We've had a conversation about that before, and it is uncomfortable. And so the unequal distribution of organizational resources was probably the first thing that hit me, but without, like, I couldn't talk about that without looking at the way that merit is, distributed, but also the services that students are receiving, the academic advising, and that's talked about in this book specifically too. But like, just so many little ways that all of these come together to create a lack of equality. It's painful.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're talking about what you were just speaking to reminds me of the fact that a lot of institutions now, particularly since the pandemic, right, have moved toward test optional admissions.
Yes,
And they're
100%.
arguing that, and you and I both work in admissions. And the argument, right, is that it's more equitable for students of color or low income students.
Yeah.
However, when you don't have a standardized test score to go off of, you're not necessarily solving all the underlying issues,
Mm-mm.
because schools are still segregated, like you said, by resource. So, and by race. So, students sometimes don't have the extra time to engage in a lot of extracurricular activities. So they don't look well-rounded on an application, or
No.
they don't receive the proper resources to do well in their courses and raise their GPA, or maybe they're food insecure, they have housing insecurity. There's all these other issues wrapped up into it. And then the cycle just continues and continues.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and no one can escape it. And at that point, like, if we're looking at an application, we're test optional. I am always excited about being test optional.
I
I talk
didn't even
about it.
know that.
Yeah, oh my God. I talk about it. I'm obsessed with it. I tell families all the time, like, we're test optional. It's permanent. I'm pumped. But, I think that was actually something that was painful for me to look at, again, because I have been someone that is a huge advocate for being test optional. And this book made my feelings complicated about that, because then looking at how it still is segregating populations from being able to enter these institutions, that's still there. And so I was like, we're breaking down barriers, we're incredible, which we are. I can't say that we're not doing something that's really important and good work, but there's so much more to it. And
Yeah.
I think that's the hard part of looking at the whole system. You can fix one thing, but is that really a whole reshaping?
Well, and I know you and I both watched the First Generation documentary.
Ugh, that was so
And
painful.
I know. And part of this reminds me, in terms of the inadequate services structure,
Yes.
the unequal distribution, any of that, reminded me that even with test optional schools out there, I chose a test optional school. Denison is test optional. And part of the reason I did that was because my family did not have the extra income to pay for testing services, or even the big, like, Princeton Review textbooks that my wealthy peers could.
Carried
Um,
around for like months on months, just like, yeah.
yeah. like I couldn't afford to do that. So I went to a test optional school,
Yes.
and I was very fortunate to do that. But in the first generation documentary, you see that students have options that they don't even know that they have.
Yeah.
So
No.
I can imagine there are so many students um, who are low income or students of color or really anyone who just isn't aware that, like in the first gen documentary, there were students that had no idea that schools out of state that are private don't charge
Oh,
out of state tuition, or that
yeah.
you could complete the FAFSA and because you're low income, get more scholarship money. You know,
Yep.
all of this information that seems readily available if you're privileged becomes much murkier when you're not in a circumstance of wealth and whiteness. So
100%. Yeah.
yeah.
Painful.
Well, I could talk about this cycle all day, but I think we'll keep going here. So the
Yeah.
first thing I want to say about this book, which, you know, for the folks watching this who have read it, you know, there aren't a ton of federal policies that are mentioned in this book. I know we're getting to federal policy right now in our class, but really what I saw a lot of was state level policy in California, where the book takes place, and then also just institutional policies.
Hmm. Hmm.
So one that stood out to me and that they continue to go back to are anti-affirmative action bans. So Prop 209, which was passed in California, came about from a case I hadn't heard of before, the 1978 Regents of the University of California versus Backey. So this stood out to me because this student, Backey, I hope I'm saying his name right, he's a white student who applied to UC in their medical school. And I work at a medical school, so that's kind of why I was like, oh, you know, my ears perked up a little bit. Um, he didn't get in, and he argued in a court of law that it was reverse discrimination against white people to have a quota based on race. He said it wasn't constitutional. And he won. He won the case, and that shocked me because, first of all, I don't think reverse discrimination exists. I don't think reverse racism exists. That's a personal opinion that I won't go further into for now, but I will just say that the ripple effects of the anti-affirmative action ban are in some ways immeasurable. When Hamilton and Nielsen said that after this, the US, or at least in California, basically decided underrepresented students don't deserve educational compensation for structural racism. We shouldn't see race as anything other than one of the other individual identities that make a college more diverse. So now diversity centers and diversity agendas, they reflect this like adoption of a really broad definition of diversity. And that's something that I struggle with because
Oh, me too.
diversity is something we've talked about in this cohort so much as being a really positive thing. And this book really complicates that.
It does, and painfully so, because you're looking at it and you're seeing that they are suggesting that it can be wrapped into one specific area or one specific center, or this is something that happens, and you're like, no, no, like that is not great. And there's like a specific part in the book um, that made me really personally uncomfortable where they, I think it was UCM
Okay.
where specifically, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but specifically they were talking about how the Latinx students didn't need a specific
Oh, yeah.
cultural center for them specifically because they were the majority of the student body.
Right.
But and so they were like, yeah, 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 you're right. We don't want to do that. We'll just make it a big center for everybody. You know what?
A
Heck,
diversity center.
a diversity, heck, doing an individualized thing. Let's do a whole diversity center and like the complexities
Um,
that come with that. And that made me so uncomfortable because
yeah.
how can you say, great, you're here, but you're the majority. So the experiences you may have, they're going to be easier because you're the majority. That's not
Right.
true. That's not true. And so
And
like,
now you don't need our funding anymore.
yeah, you don't need that. You don't need the extra resources, which if you're looking back at the cycle, it's not true.
Yeah. Well, and that goes into the diversity agendas and regimes that we have on the screen here, but there's a
Yeah.
connection to austerity too, because the argument was that
Yeah.
you have enough resources as the majority, but what about when students of color don't see themselves reflected in the faculty or the
Yes.
staff.
Yes.
They may have peer-to-peer support, which is wonderful, but they also don't see themselves in the academic articles that they read or in the lab where they're doing research. So it's so important not to take those things away. I mean, so University of Central Florida, for those who don't know, is technically an HSI. We get a lot of our funding based on that fact that, we serve a diverse student population and we are financially rewarded for it, which is one of the benefits that we get. And the authors talk about this symbiotic relationship between students of color and institutions who get funding because they welcome students of color. But I can't imagine at UCF someone arguing that, we have so many Hispanic students now. Let's get rid of the Hispanic Cultural Center. Doesn't make any sense, but that was an argument used by someone in this book. So, yeah, that was remarkable.
Cringy. That was very cringy for me. I was
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
no, let's not do that.
right. Well, speaking of cringe, I want to talk about P3s. Okay, so
I
this
don't ever
is,
want to talk about P3.
yeah, talking about uncomfortable, right? So
Yeah, good time.
there is a whole chapter devoted to P3s, which are public-private partnerships. And before reading this book, I had no idea that my school, that University of Central Florida COM, the College of Medicine, has like a ton of P3s, but I didn't know what they were. I knew that we had partnerships with HCA, which is the Health Corporations of America. But I didn't really understand why or how they came about or really what that meant. So this book defines a P3 as an educational delivery strategy in which public universities contract private sector entities to provide infrastructure no longer offered by the state. So this is an option that under-resourced institutions, often ones that serve low income or students of color, have to go to because they face dissolution if they don't. These are not used in times when things are going well. You don't see these being used by private schools, right? Like Denison.
Yeah.
You don't see these being used by flagship universities like OSU, really. You don't see these being used by places that have a large endowment or a big alumni association with a lot of wealthy donors. Because other institutions can, if the federal government pulls back, they can go to those things. I know Denison has a huge endowment and they talk about it all the time.
I mean,
Um,
I think
yeah.
that's typical. Like Ohio University, we rely so heavily on our alumni association.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
that's just something that we talk about every day when it comes to our community, how big that community is, because we are a community of current Bobcats and Bobcats that have left Athens, Ohio to explore the world and create
Look at
wonderful
all these things
careers.
they're
And
doing.
yeah,
Yeah.
look at all the great things that are happening, and we bring them back to have conversation and to hire from within. So that's just another way of that like cycle existing, of
Yeah.
creating that support that exists. That institutions like new universities, when they have to rely on a P3, they don't have that, which is
I was gonna
devastating.
say they're so new. They don't really have that built-in
Mhm.
base, or they haven't had the time really to build up an endowment.
Yes,
So,
yes.
I came into UCF not really knowing how new it was. I just knew it was, I considered it very successful because of our enrollment numbers, right?
Oh yeah.
But we've outpaced ourselves
Yeah.
and we don't have the infrastructure to support 70,000 students. So we decided to partner with HCA and they said, we will build you a teaching hospital. I mean, a parking lot away from our building. And we will support your students who need to do their specialty rotations there. So a lot of our students do that and it's wonderful. However, there are some red flags that come with being in a P3 that I didn't think about because our founding dean, her name is Dr. German, she only talks about this P3 in a really positive light. She's never ever considered or at least talked publicly about the backlash associated with it. And there has been plenty. I hear it from our students all the time. So we get students all the time that come in and say, can we do rotations at Advent Health or Orlando Health? Some of the biggest hospital systems in Orlando or in Florida in general. And we have to say, nope, because we are solely committed contractually to HCA. And there aren't many HCA facilities near us. So it's actually hurting our competitiveness in the marketplace because students are like, well, I could just go to UF or
Yeah.
USF or any
Yeah.
of these other places and actually get experience in these, well-known not-for-profit hospital systems. But some of the red flags, like financialization, is brought up in this book. That's the financial reliance of the infrastructure and kind of the backing from a company leading to large debt just to meet your basic needs, or the privatization of higher ed, which is an issue we've again talked about in this whole cohort, and kind of relying on a company that has stake in profit, which HCA is one of those. They are a for-profit healthcare system. They don't care about social welfare. They care about profit. And so that leads to a lack of shared vision, and that's problematic. And that leads me to this last point, which is that private partners don't have a financial incentive to make alterations outside of your contract. They will do and make decisions that are best for them, best for business, saves the most money, makes the most profit. And that's really my concern moving forward, because we just found out, and I don't know if I've told you this yet, Alyssa, but we found out that HCA is thinking about funding student housing for our medical students, which is a problem in Orlando. Like, housing is extremely expensive. We're in a housing crisis, and our medical students can't really afford to live here, and you can't have a job while you're in medical school.
Yeah.
So they need housing. But HCA is going to provide it with the caveat that it's also open to the general public. So I don't think that it's going to be affordable student housing.
No, not at
So
all.
I don't think
That's
it's going to solve the problem.
probably not. It might
Um,
add some.
yeah. So anyway, I could go on and on, but that's just something that is it's a policy that's talked about in this book a lot that hits home.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's incredible. I appreciate actual examples of your real day, everyday life. Like, that is just bonkers to me. When I was going through this book, I specifically remember getting to the section that talks about tolerable sub-optimization. And I think I like texted you or something, just like, what is happening? Like, what is this? Because I was so disgusted by this idea of what is defined as an official policy proposed at higher education levels as a stopgap measure to reduce the staff overload without hiring more staff or increasing compensation. So basically what's happening here is, specifically at these underrepresented institutions where there are students all over the place that are really in need of specific resources. We see that cycle come back that we talked about earlier. The resources that they're receiving are dwindling. They're losing money. They have a lack of resources, and there are so few people to actually help create the support that the students need. Specifically, the example in the book was about academic advising,
Oh
and
yeah.
that hit home for me so much. I work so closely with some phenomenal academic advisors in my life, and so I just specifically remember reading about how upset they were that the support they could give to students was so small. They had no bandwidth. They had
Like
such tiny.
750 to 1.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
insane. Like, they could barely have that support that they wanted to be giving to these students. And it was heartbreaking for them just as much as it was heartbreaking for those students. And they often ended up, just both of them, really upset about the situation. And it reminded me of the the Gandara article that we read for the class,
Yeah.
that talks about when resources are so limited, underrepresented students are often, disadvantaged because the resources that are specifically allocated that they may need more than the other privileged students are then taken away as a way to cut cost. And so it reminded me of that. It made me sad. It just really hurt. It hit home thinking about the fact that, there are so many students that may need that extra support, and we're taking that away when it comes to budget cuts, and in situations where new universities simply do not have the money, the staffing, or the ability to really keep those resources in place. And while I wish that I could be in the background saying, like, keep student resources at the front, if they have to
Yeah.
keep their doors open, what options do they have? Where do they have to
Well,
cut back?
yeah, and the idea that like it's being mandated by your
Yeah.
leadership because this is a policy.
Can
Um,
you imagine? Okay, what
no.
would you do right now if your boss on Monday was like, hey, Grace, hope you're doing well. Listen, we're going to just we're gonna stop where we're at. Just do what you can. Okay. You can't do all the stuff. So just
Yeah.
do what you can. If you can't get to it, oh well, move on.
I mean, I've been, unfortunately, I'm so lucky now to not be in that situation because the medical school at most can hold 480 students. That's like
Okay. Yeah.
the rule for us to keep our accreditation. But when I worked for the graduate school, or when I worked at Columbus State Community College, unfortunately, it was like that because we only had 5 advisors and we were advising every single first semester student at Columbus State, every single one, regardless of their major, regardless of their age, their background, or what have you. And so everybody was a number, and you didn't form real relationships with these people. And it was sold to us as like, well, that's necessity. Like there's
That's
only enough
life.
hours in the day. We only have
Uh,
this much money to pay you all. And so students are going to fall through the cracks. Students are going to drop out of their classes. Students are going to fail. And that's part of the game. And it was really hard for me because it was pretty new. And I did fall to, compassion fatigue, and I still
oh my
struggle with those
gosh.
things, but I value the student to student, or sorry, the student interactions because where I am now, because I can actually talk to them and like get to know them and
That's
give them
yeah.
some of my time.
That's my favorite part of my job. I opted this specific year to teach an undecided arts and sciences learning community, which at
Yeah,
Ohio University is just a way to help undecided students kind of figure out what those next steps are. It's the best
yeah,
part of
very
my day
important.
every single day because there's something so special about seeing those through students through their cycle of like, I'm gonna apply. I'm really nervous. I don't know what I like. I've been admitted. How do I fill out the FAFSA? And like being there for all those parts, it's really, really special. But then seeing them here making a difference to the community, so impactful, so incredible. And I often tell my supervisor a lot, like, wouldn't it be incredible to be able to share with our advisors and our staff that are feeling burnt out because you work in admissions, you know how recruitment season is. You know how intense searching for students is, especially with COVID and budget cuts and larger classes each year and always trying to exceed some invisible number somewhere. You know how much that can just lead to burnout. And so if we could help with that emotional compassion, labor aspect, the fatigue that's existing, and bottle that excitement of the student experience of being here, finally making it to their institution and having these big dreams and goals and seeing that happiness, I think it could be so impactful. The same way that if the leadership having to make these really hard decisions, I think if they were boots on the ground in any of these situations, I mean, our other course in this program this semester is about leadership, and I can't imagine being a leader in these
These
situations having to
scenarios.
make a decision. But if only they were boots on the ground, if they
I was
saw
gonna
that student
say,
excitement, would it
I
change the way that they're doing things? What would they cut at that point?
well, and that's what I was gonna say is like, unfortunately, I think when we do have the unique opportunity to confront leadership and ask why, what was the why behind these decisions, it always comes back to money,
Yeah.
which is where the private partnerships and all that come in, and the tolerable sub-optimization. It all comes back to money. And when I was reading the part about advising, and tolerable sub-optimization, I felt so, again, very privileged because they said at private schools, the advising load's about 100 to 1. I think mine was even lower than that. It may have been 50 to 1. I
Oh,
had continuous access to this person, and at a mid-sized school, it was about 300 to 351. And then at a place like UCR or UCM, 700, 800 to 1.
yeah.
I just can't even imagine that. Oh, so, oh, skipped ahead. Sorry, folks. So this next portion, we're just going to be touching on a few of these themes because as you can see here, like there are so many themes in this book. There's even more than what we've put here. This is not exhaustive, but
No.
these bolded ones here, I think, are worth kind of expanding on, whereas these other ones, we've kind of touched on already.
Yeah.
But yeah, I want to know a little bit more because you have more experience than I've only been in admissions for less than a year. So I kind of want to
Yeah.
hear about what marketing inclusive excellence means and how it kind of plays out in your world.
Yeah. Okay. So I remember distinctly getting to this part and just like underlining, highlighting it, making some notes, and just feeling uncomfortable. at Ohio University, we use this specific tagline, inclusive excellence. And at first, I was so excited about it. I was like, oh my gosh, I love this. This is empowering. This is powerful. This is the kind of institution that I really want to work at when they're using these big, important terms. But then when I boiled it down, I was like, what do these big, important terms mean? Do we have a diversity agenda? Do we have a specific area where we're outlining the importance of what this actually looks like?
Do we
And
have
painfully,
accountability and outcome?
painfully, the answer is no to that, which is sad. We do have a strategic plan that includes diversity. Do we meet that? No. Are the words vague? Are they uncomfortable? Yeah. Often for me, when it comes to marketing inclusive excellence, we have students that we are using
Okay.
as a form of equity or racialized equity labor, as it's kind of mentioned in the book, but basically we're asking these students to be part of our institution and kind of scream diversity, be the identity of diversity at Ohio University. We're asking them to be the representation. We're using the same photos over and over again. We're using their stories. We're hearing their voices, but we're almost overutilizing. And the book talks a little bit about that really fine line between marketing inclusive excellence and tokenization. And so there is that really uncomfortable situation where there are days at work and I'm like, why are we making this decision? This is uncomfortable. And it can be really painful when we're asking specific students and they look at you and they say, I'm not comfortable doing this anymore. I've been on this cover too many times. I think you should ask someone else. And that's the reality of when we are marketing inclusive excellence, but we don't have the diversity numbers. We don't have
To back it up with
the
the
backup.
marketing.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
we're like trying to offer something we can't actually offer.
Deliver.
Yeah.
Well,
We're
I think
like,
it's so, it's funny that you say that because I distinctly remember, I'm years removed now from my graduation, but I will never forget hearing from marginalized students at Denison saying, I feel tricked.
yep.
I feel tricked because all of the magazines that came to my door had people that looked like me on it. And every phone call I had, they connected me with a peer who, had the same background as me. And it seems very planned and very
Yes.
strategic. And I
Yes.
can say, from my limited experience in admissions, it absolutely is. Every time we have an admissions event, like an information session online or a student tour, it's who's on the panel. Do you have at least one Black student on the panel? Do you have this one, Latina student? Did you contact her? Can she do it? Because I'm sorry, but out of 120 students in each class, we are lucky to have 3 or 4 students of
Yep.
color. We are lucky. And
Exactly.
now our accreditation is at risk for it, even though we don't have affirmative action, and we don't have a specific quota. It's like an underlying understanding that you need to meet certain expectations of diversity to match the diversity agenda that we're advertising. But at what cost? Are we doing it the right way? And it sounds like for you and I in our work that that's not the case. So it's
Uncomfortable.
frustrating.
It is.
Yeah.
It's uncomfortable and it's kind of one of those things where you have to just address that. And I think that's something that this book really made me rethink. And
Yeah.
and we talked a little bit about rankings and prestige when it came to the cycle that we talked about, but I always like to come back and hit the idea of like this is such a privileged thought. The idea of being in the news report, US News, World Report, these rankings come from that privileged experience, the privileged alumni, and having the application pool come from elite students and wealthy background. And it just comes back to this same conversation about how it's just inequitable. So much of the system and the cycle is inequitable. And so the battle for rankings and prestige, it's really painful because no matter how much these new universities are fighting and working to have that research, they are just always knocked down a little bit because the systems are so in place and they have been for so long that it's so hard to flip the top. The Ivy Leagues are
People
always up
question
there.
it. Yeah,
Yeah.
people start to say, well, do I even trust this report anymore? Because Harvard and Yale and Princeton aren't at the top. So they start to like delegitimize it
Yeah.
in a way, which is, I mean, you're fighting an uphill battle already. And then to
Yeah.
add that in is like really another
Yep. Yep.
another thing. But the prestige is in a lot of ways determined by how segregated the school is, because as we talked about before, merit, bleeds into segregation, and how many white students are at the school in a lot of ways is connected to how much financial resources is coming in. And so when there's more financial resources, they're able to compete in the amenity wars that we've read about so many times in this class. And then that will determine their ranking. And then it just continues and continues, unfortunately. Oh boy.
Yep.
I want to also kind of touch very briefly on austerity logic. I know that it's not bolded here, but I just wanted to briefly touch on this because I wasn't familiar with the term austerity before I read this book, and
I wasn't either.
okay, I was gonna say, was that your experience?
No.
But
Yeah, I
I
was like,
kind
what?
it's a lot like neoliberalism to me anyway. It seems like this is more of the practice and not necessarily the ideology, but I mean, I could be wrong. I'm still getting a handle of it, but austerity logic is essentially the idea that there's an economic solution to too much government spending, which is funny because we've mostly been talking in this class about not enough
Yep.
government spending in higher ed. And so
I
this is
know.
kind of the opposite and the extreme to say,
I laughed out loud, actually. Like, I
did
literally
you?
was like,
Yeah.
yes, I was like, huh, I wonder what our classmates would say if they just read this one line from this book, because this is like outrageous compared to what we're talking about in the discussion posts we're constantly like fighting over, like, now more money here.
Yes. And this is saying
Yeah.
just let the free market take reign and individual responsibility will work everything out. And that's obviously very closely tied to racial neoliberalism, modern segregation, the myth of merit. We've talked about all these things, but I just thought it was interesting that this book is really talking about there are people on the complete opposite side of my positionality, and I'm wondering who are these people making these arguments, and it tends to be the corporate people that are brought in to solve the money issues, and they come in guns a-blazing with colorblind austerity,
Yes, they
which
do.
only produces and reproduces harmful racial hierarchies and
Over and over.
deepens wealth gaps, and students reap the consequences. And it's the students at UCM and UCR. And I think one of the examples from the book that ties in perfectly with this is the letter from a
Oh,
lot of the faculty and staff
yeah.
at the really wealthy and prestigious UCs, so UCLA, for example, or UC Berkeley, who came together and said, we don't really want to share our budget with UCM and UCR. They're not performing to our standards. Basically, they're not as good at us as us, and we recommend that you either stop pretending that we're all equal and give us money based on our performance. So they're asking for performance-based funding, which again, very different from our perspective.
Disgusting.
And then they're saying, or if you don't want to do that, if that's, I think they said, if that's too hard, then just dissolve those institutions.
Just get rid of them. We don't need them. Those students,
I,
the underrepresented students, they're fine. They can just they don't need an education. They're
I was
fine.
shocked. I
I
was
was
shocked.
I was screaming at the book. I
Yeah,
was like, are you
it
kidding?
was,
Someone wrote this. An educated human being said, actually, you know what? They don't need an education. They don't need it. It's fine. It's better for
yeah,
us if
we
they
don't
don't have
need to,
access.
yeah. I just found that really, really frustrating. And for those who read the book, you know exactly what
Yeah.
I'm talking about. So speaking of the book,
Ugh.
I'd love for you to kind of reflect first and kind of talk
Mhm.
about how your thoughts have changed since reading this book. Like, how have the themes helped you rethink any kind of policy or governance in higher ed?
Yeah. Oh gosh, Grace. I feel like we've talked about this book a lot through text, through conversation, through calls, through screaming,
Meetings.
through to into the
Yeah.
void together. But I think it's important that every single part of what I do feels like it's changed a little bit. I didn't know what a new university was. I didn't
Me
know. I had
neither.
no idea. I remember
Yeah.
being like, a new what? So that is foundational, and I'm really happy to have that knowledge. But
Yeah.
coming from an admission standpoint, so much of what I do, when we talked about being test optional, that changed my perspective of that. I don't think it's enough anymore. I don't think being test
Yeah.
optional is enough. I used to say, at least we're doing that. And yes, at least we're doing that, but I don't think it's enough.
Right.
I used to be really happy that when we held student panels, like you mentioned, that we'd always have a student of color to make sure that they were there to help talk about their experience. But then I started overthinking, like, yes, this relationships exist, but is this safe? Are we just asking for this rationalized labor, and not just an emotional labor, but are students then being tricked into thinking that there are going to be populations of students here that they can identify with? And we don't have that at Ohio University. That just isn't the truth. And so are we selling them something that we're marketing, that idea of having inclusive excellence, but we don't have that. We don't have the student population that they're looking for. And student development theory, are they going to say, I wish that there were more students who looked like me and I could look at them and say, these are the ways that I can see myself succeeding. These are the ways that I have different paths that I can choose from. Are they
Yeah.
going to feel like they were lied to, similar to what you're talking about with some of the students you went to school with at Denison? I mean, that's painful, and it's uncomfortable to think about. We would be using this brand, specifically. The book mentions that different institutions, sometimes more of the elite institutions, started using the brand words or like the buzzwords of inclusive excellence. And I guess I started rethinking what that looked like. I mentioned I loved it, and I did. I was so excited about it, but now it feels almost like a buzzword. It
Icky.
feels a little bit icky. Yeah, yeah. It
Yeah.
feels like uncomfortable and like heavy. So,
Uh,
and I don't know. That is kind of where I guess a little bit of everything, but policies
mhm.
when it comes to inclusive excellency, when it comes to diversity, when it comes to really supporting students, all of these have changed.
Yeah.
What about you?
I feel the same way in the sense that, when I talked about diversity before, even last semester when we were in a diversity in higher ed class,
Mm,
I was like, diversity is a great thing. There's nothing, it's only got a positive connotation. And then I read this book and I read about, hollow diversity agendas and the benign commitment to diversity and just kind of meeting minimums for the sake of it or for the sake of getting extra government funding. Um,
yeah.
and I thought to myself, there is a side to this whole enterprise of ulterior motives. And it's nothing that I ever was exposed to in my role because I mean, I'm pretty new in my career, right? Like I've only worked in higher ed since 2019. So I'm still naive in a lot of ways, still thinking that I am a cog in a really
Same.
important organization. I mean, I wouldn't even want to call it a machine. Like, I still hesitate to refer to students as customers. And a lot of this program has helped me kind of pull back the curtain a little bit. And sometimes it hurts and sometimes it's important. Um, and this book has made me look at diversity spaces differently. Um,
Yeah.
I don't think of all-in-one spaces as being useful anymore. I mean, I think the authors even refer to it as being dangerous almost because
Hmm.
there's no place left to turn. If everybody's welcome there, that's already what the institution should be. So what
Yeah.
is the purpose of an additional space where everybody's welcome again? And again, like it's hard to put into words or argue in a meeting with leadership or your colleagues because you may come off looking like the bad guy. But I think if you read this whole book, maybe you would feel that way. So, yeah. And then I
Maybe a
think,
Christmas gift to some people.
ooh, and then I think, lastly, like the symbiotic relationship with a diversity agenda hits home for me because there are students of color who benefit from marketing inclusive excellence. They still get the education. Sometimes they end up at a school like UCF that has a lot of access to high quality professors, good research experience, and they end up with the credential, but we use them and abuse them through the process.
Yeah, we do.
Um, and the alternative is not always great. So that's really what I've come away with from this. But we're coming to a close here. So final thoughts, what kind of examples are you thinking about where you might use this book in your real work or even in your research interest? Because I know we're getting into capstone and we're close to graduation. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no. Honestly, Grace, I think this book has changed a lot of the way that I think I would go about some specific practices in higher ed.
Okay.
I think that I would encourage future institutions that I work at to review their diversity agendas and determine if the work that they're asking everyone to do is work that is genuine, if it's work that has a strong meaning behind it, and to make sure that they're not just a mouthpiece. You know, the leadership involved is actually going through and being supportive, because that's so, so important. And I mean, we're taking our leadership course right now, and I think that these two courses go together really well because we're talking about how these diversity initiatives are so, so important if they're genuine and if they're all the way through. And so I think I would start by checking in to see where diversity exists in leadership's experiences, what they want to do with it, and how much of a focus it is for their institution. I'm There's a specific quote that talks about how universities build infrastructures around diversity that can actually potentially make campuses less rather than make them more comfortable and safer for racially marginalized students. And so I think I would start by having conversations with students that are in that minority group, students that are feeling like they need more, to find out what they truly need and not leave it to leadership or the expectation of the institution to know what those students need without having those true conversations and having a really genuine relationship, so that it is more of what you were just talking about, where it's something that's comfortable and safe. And so both are really earning from it. And it's not more of that racialized labor. But it also changed my research interest a little bit, because I have a pretty big interest in test optional policies. I might be writing my leadership paper on that. I'm not sure yet. I'm thinking about
Oh.
it. Yeah, I know, a little teaser, but it kind of makes me think of the way that I suddenly thought test optional was amazing. It's like, oh my gosh, I love it so much. The differences between test optional, the differences between test blind. And again, another quote, but they specifically say that the use of standardized tests to measure aptitude and intelligence is one of the most effective and racist policies that were ever designed to degrade Black minds and legally exclude Black bodies from higher education institutions. And that's powerful, that's
It is.
painful, that's uncomfortable. And so I want to dig into that. I think I really want to find what that looks like and how do we go about changing that. And I'll just, one last thought I had is that this book at the end, the two authors do so much of the work for us. You know, they really start talking about, we can do this and these are options and we could talk about this. And I think that's so important, because often you leave reading a book that is this powerful and this painful feeling deflated, and you're like, I don't know where to go from here. And so the suggestions at the end of the book kind of help you feel like, okay, there's work to be done and these are the places that I can start, instead of just feeling like, wow, the entire system has failed and there's nothing I can do now.
Yeah.
But what about you?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that they were intentional about offering actual solutions at the end,
Yeah.
and saying these are the issues. Here's certain ways we can come at it, and they give several different attack angles. Some of them federal, some of them state, some of them at the institutional level.
Yeah.
I have had a research interest since we were in finance and budgeting, with free college programs.
Mm,
So this book near the end, in the concluding chapter, the authors suggest reform to free college programs. They say that they should be first dollar rather than last dollar programs.
yeah.
So I don't have a say, right, in anything like that, but it is a research interest of mine. And there are connections to our other readings, Collier and Panther, or Perna.
Yeah.
And we've learned about promise programs as being somewhat of solutions to bringing more equity in higher ed, more inclusion. And what these authors are saying is, even in the current system, it's really not very effective if it's going to be last dollar, because at the end of the day, the students who are privileged are still getting the majority of the funding, and that wasn't even the purpose of the program. So you really have to fund people at the first dollar level to get to the neediest students. So that's something that I find really interesting. Other than that, I'm really interested in this equity efficiency quandary that Desjardins has spoke about since 2002. I mean, this is an ongoing issue where administrators, policymakers, the people with the money have to decide, how do we efficiently distribute this money and do it equitably? And I think what we're seeing, based on the information I've read in this book, is that they're not doing a great job of that.
What?
They're using austerity logics, practicing racial neoliberalism. They're perpetuating harmful diversity regimes that actually harm minority students, and they're using one-stop shop diversity diversity spaces to resolve these issues with really the least amount of thought possible. And that, to me, kind of lights a fire under me, because I want to be the person in the room that says, can we stop for a second? I mean, I've learned